And you may have heard recently that France is launching their own Linux desktop plan to get away from the Slopposaurus called Windows.
Germany just did something that could cost Microsoft billions, and almost nobody is talking about it. Because this isn't just about money, it's about the moment an entire continent realized it might not be in control anymore. Imagine waking up, going to work, opening your computer, and suddenly you're locked out of everything. No email, no files, nothing. Not because you did something wrong, but because someone else made a decision. That actually happened to one of the most powerful prosecutors in the world. And what happened next forced governments across Europe to ask a terrifying question. Could this happen to us? Because if the answer is yes, then every system they rely on, every email, every document, every conversation could disappear overnight. And that's exactly why Germany made a move that is now spreading across Europe faster than anyone expected. In this video, I'll show you what really happened, why countries are quietly walking away from Microsoft, and the one hidden risk that changed everything. Because Germany didn't just save 15 million euros a year, they exposed a problem that could change the future of global tech. And the craziest part? Germany wasn't even the first to realize this. It started with something that looked small. One morning, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court sat at his desk and tried to check his email. It didn't work. Not a glitch. Not a hack. He had been cut off. Instantly. No warning. Now think about that. This is someone responsible for global justice, suddenly unable to do his job. And it wasn't a technical failure. It was a decision. And that's when people started asking, if this can happen to him, what's stopping it from happening to anyone else? But the real shock wasn't the event itself. It was what it revealed. Because this wasn't just about one person losing access, it exposed something much bigger. Power. If a company can shut down access instantly, then whoever controls that company has influence over everyone using it, governments included. And suddenly, this wasn't a tech issue anymore. It was a sovereignty issue. Who actually controls your systems? Who controls your data? Who can turn things off? That's when one German state decided not to wait for an answer. They took action. A region in Germany called Schleswig-Holstein made a decision that most governments wouldn't even consider. They decided to remove Microsoft. Not partially, not as a test, completely. And this wasn't a small change. Thousands of employees, millions of files, years of data, all connected to one system. So the real question is, how do you even replace something like that? Because most governments don't leave, not because they don't want to, but because they think they can't. But this time, they actually did it, step by step. They started with email, then documents, then communication tools, replacing everything with open source alternatives. Outlook became Thunderbird, Office became LibreOffice, and slowly, the dependency started to disappear. But it wasn't easy. There were problems. People had to relearn everything. Workflows changed, things slowed down, and that's exactly the point where most would quit. But they didn't. They kept going because they understood something simple. Short-term pain for long-term control, and then the numbers came in. 44,000 accounts migrated, 110 million emails moved. At that scale, this is no longer an experiment. This is proof. But the most important number was the cost. 9 million euros, one time, compared to 15 million euros every single year. So in less than 7 months, they recovered everything. After that, they weren't just independent, they were saving money every year. And that's when everything changed. Because now the question isn't, can this be done? Now it's, why isn't everyone doing it? And once that idea starts spreading, it doesn't stop. Because Germany didn't just leave Microsoft, they proved that leaving is possible. And once you prove that, you create a blueprint, and blueprints spread. Because what Germany escaped from is something most governments are still stuck in. And it doesn't look like a trap at first. It actually looks convenient. You start with one tool, maybe email, then documents, then meetings, then storage, and before you notice, everything is connected. Everything runs through the same system, and that's where the problem begins. Because now, leaving isn't just switching one tool, it means replacing everything at the same time. And that feels impossible. It's like building your entire house on someone else's land. At first, it's fine. Everything works. But one day you realize you don't own the ground. And if something changes, you can't just pick up the house and leave. That's the situation most governments are in. They didn't plan it this way. It just happened slowly over years, one decision at a time, until suddenly they're locked in. And the longer they stay, the harder it becomes to leave. Because now there's more data, more systems, more people trained on the same tools. So even if prices go up, even if risks increase, they stay. Not because it's the best option, but because it feels like the only option. That's the trap. And for years, everyone believed there was no way out. But what Germany did breaks that idea completely. Because now we know something different. Leaving isn't impossible. It's just uncomfortable. And once you understand that, you start seeing the situation differently. Because now the real question isn't why leave? It's why stay? Once Germany proved it worked, something started to spread. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly and quickly. First, Denmark. No big announcement, no headlines. They didn't make it a big moment. They just started switching, replacing Microsoft tools with open source alternatives, almost like they didn't want attention. But that's what made it more interesting, because when governments move quietly, it usually means they're serious. Then came France. This time, more direct. They decided to replace Microsoft Teams completely across government departments, not test it, replace it. Then Austria, then Switzerland, each one making small moves, but all in the same direction. And now something changes, because this is no longer one country experimenting. This is multiple countries making the same decision independently, and that's important, because when one country moves, it's a risk. When several do, it's a trend. But when they all start moving in the same direction, it becomes a shift. And here's where it gets interesting. These countries aren't coordinating publicly. There's no big European announcement, no single plan. Yet they're all arriving at the same conclusion, almost at the same time, which raises a bigger question. What are they all seeing that most people still don't? Because this kind of behavior doesn't happen by accident. Governments don't change infrastructure randomly. There has to be a reason, a strong one. And once that reason becomes clear, this stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like the beginning of something much bigger. At first, this looked like a political move, or maybe a security concern, but when governments started looking at the numbers, everything changed. Because the costs were much bigger than people expected. Germany alone spent 481 million euros in just 1 year on Microsoft licenses, and that number wasn't going down. It was going up, fast, year after year. And here's the problem. Once you're inside the system, you don't really negotiate. You pay. Because leaving feels too expensive, too complicated, too risky. So even if prices increase, you stay. And that's exactly how the system works. Slow increases, long contracts, deep integration. Until one day, you're spending hundreds of millions with no easy way out. But then Germany did something simple. They showed the alternative. 9 million euros, one time. That's what it costs to leave, compared to 15 million every single year. And suddenly, the numbers don't make sense anymore, because now staying looks more expensive than leaving. And that flips the entire conversation. Before, the question was, can we afford to leave? Now it becomes, can we afford to stay? And once that question enters the room, everything changes because now it's no longer emotional. It's logical, it's measurable, it's obvious. And when governments start making decisions based on clear numbers, they move. Not fast, but definitely. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. Because once the financial reality becomes clear, it's only a matter of time before others follow. Up to this point, you could argue this was about money, or strategy, or even politics. But then comes something most people have never heard of, a law called the Cloud Act. And it changes everything, because it's very simple. If your data is stored by an American company, the US government can request access to it. It doesn't matter where the data is. It could be in Germany, in France, in any European server. It doesn't matter. If the company is American, the law still applies. Now think about that for a second. A European government storing sensitive information on systems they don't fully control under laws they didn't create. That's not just a technical issue. That's a power issue because it means control doesn't fully belong to them. And for years, this was known, but ignored because switching felt too difficult, too disruptive, too unrealistic. So they accepted the risk, quietly, but once Germany proved leaving was possible, that excuse disappeared. And suddenly, this law became impossible to ignore because now the question isn't hypothetical anymore. Now it's real. If access can be requested, who actually owns the data? And more importantly, who can see it? Because once that doubt enters the system, trust starts to break. And when trust breaks at that level, everything else follows. And that's exactly what happened next. In this context, Europe was already uncomfortable. They understood the risks, they saw the costs, they knew the dependency was real. But there was still one thing holding everything together: trust. Because as long as they believed companies would protect them, they could justify staying. And for a while, that's exactly what they were told. Microsoft reassured them. They made public statements. They talked about security, about protecting European data, about standing up to pressure. They basically said, you can trust us. And for many governments, that was enough. Because switching systems is hard. Trust is easier. But then something happened that changed everything. When pressure came, they didn't hesitate. They complied immediately, no delay, no resistance. And in that moment, all those promises stopped mattering. Because now there was a clear difference between what was said and what actually happens in reality. And that difference is dangerous because trust doesn't break slowly. It breaks instantly. One moment you believe the system works, and the next moment you're not so sure anymore. And once that doubt appears, you can't remove it. Every decision starts to feel risky. Every system feels uncertain. And that's when governments started thinking differently. Not just about cost, not just about convenience, but about control. Because now the question isn't, can we trust them? It becomes, should we depend on them at all? And once that question enters the conversation, there's only one direction things can go. At this stage, something changes. This is no longer about testing ideas or exploring options. This is commitment. Because governments don't rebuild systems lightly. It takes time, money, training, coordination. And once they start, they don't go halfway. They go all in. And that's exactly what's happening now. One by one, they're rebuilding their infrastructure from the ground up. Not around convenience, but around control. Switching to open source software, using local providers, creating systems they actually own. And that's a very different mindset. Because before, the goal was efficiency. Now, the goal is independence. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. Because even if the old system works, the risk is already exposed. The trust is already broken. The dependency is already understood. So going back would mean accepting all of that again. And that's not something governments do easily. Which is why this moment matters. Because this is the point where change becomes permanent. Not fast, not loud, but irreversible. And here's the key detail most people miss. This isn't happening because everything failed. It's happening because something better became possible. Germany proved it, others confirmed it, and now the idea is spreading. Quietly, but consistently. And once enough countries make that move, this stops being a trend. It becomes the new standard, and that's when the real impact begins. Because what comes next won't just affect one company, it will affect the entire system. Now here's where things start to feel different. It's easy to think this is just about software, or companies, or tools, but it's not. This is much bigger than that. Because what's really happening here is a shift in control. For years, governments focused on what worked best, what was easiest, what was fastest, what was already built. And most of the time, that meant relying on external technology, mostly from the US, and for a long time, that worked. Everything ran smoothly. Systems improved. Costs felt manageable. But underneath all of that, something was building. Dependency. Slow. Almost invisible. Until one day, it becomes too big to ignore. Because the more you depend on something, the less control you have over it. And that's the realization happening now. This isn't about one company, it's about a system. A model where critical infrastructure is controlled by someone else. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. Because now every decision looks different. Every contract, every system, every integration, they're no longer just technical choices, they're strategic ones. And that changes everything. Because now governments aren't asking, what's the best tool? They're asking, well, who controls the tool? And that question leads to very different answers. Because once control becomes the priority, the entire system has to change. And that's exactly what we're starting to see. Not just in one country, not just in Europe, but as a global shift. And the moment that shift becomes clear, this stops being a tech story and becomes a power story. So what's the real lesson here? It's not just about governments, and it's not just about Microsoft. This applies to anyone building something today, because what we're really seeing is the cost of dependency. When you build on top of something you don't control, you're also accepting its rules, its risks, its limitations, its decisions, even the ones you can't see yet. And at the beginning, that trade-off feels worth it. It's faster, it's easier, it works. But over time, that convenience turns into dependence, and dependence quietly becomes risk. Not immediately, but eventually. Because the moment something changes, pricing, policies, access, you don't get to decide what happens next. You react. And that's the key difference. Control means you decide. Dependency means you adapt. And most people don't notice this until it's too late. That's exactly what happened here. For years, everything worked until one day they realized they didn't fully control the system they relied on. And by then, leaving felt almost impossible. So here's the real takeaway. If you're building anything, a business, a brand, a system, you have to ask one simple question. What do I actually control? Not just today, but long term. Because the tools you choose now shape your options later. And most people optimize for speed, but the ones who think long term optimize for control. That doesn't mean you avoid every platform. That's unrealistic, but it does mean you stay aware. You diversify. You avoid putting everything in one place. Because the goal isn't to eliminate risk. It's to avoid being trapped by it. And that's the shift happening right now, not just at a government level, but everywhere. People are starting to realize that control isn't a luxury. It's a strategy. And once you understand that, you start making very different decisions. And here's the part almost nobody is talking about. If Europe successfully pulls this off, it won't just affect Microsoft. It could reshape the entire balance of power in tech. Because once one region proves independence is possible, others will try. And there's already one region experimenting with something even more extreme, But that's a story for another video.